Today we are going to be looking at the origins of the European Union. The aftermath of World War II saw the creation of many international organisations. These organisations were established as a remedy to the countless European wars that extreme nationalism had provoked, and sought to improve international relations in a number of different fields. For example, in the area of foreign affairs, the United Nations, the UN, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, NATO, were established. Concerning economic matters, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the European Economic Community, the EEC, were created. Finally, in the social field, the Council of Europe sought to ensure the respect of human rights through the adoption of the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR. The countries of Western Europe in particular realised the need for transnational cooperation, not only to avoid future wars between them, but also to ensure Europe's economic and political survival. It should be recalled that by the end of World War II, the United Kingdom was nearly bankrupt. Germany was destroyed. France and Italy were no longer major economic powers, and Spain and Portugal were isolated dictatorships. Further, Central and Eastern Europe now formed part of the communist bloc. Thus, the former great powers of Europe seemed spent. Instead, the world was divided into two main political blocs, the United States, or US, and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. It was in this context that the nations of Western Europe realised that they would have to come together if they were to have the necessary political and economic clout to rival these new powers. The later arrival of Japan as a major economic power only served to reinforce this view. With the exception of the Council of Europe, the process of European integration has mainly occurred in the context of either the European Union or the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. Indeed, to a large extent, European integration can be considered a competition between the respective integration ideologies of these two organisations. The EU methodology involving a partial surrender of national sovereignty, creating a truly integrated pan-European supranational organisation, and the EFTA approach, seeking a less intrusive form of integration based upon intergovernmental cooperation and no real surrender of sovereignty. Now let's take a look at the first steps towards union in Europe. As a first step towards integration, the European nations sought to prevent future European wars through the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. By the end of the 1940s, the Allied powers had begun to withdraw their troops from Germany, and as part of this process, the coal and steel industries of the German Ruhr Valley were to be returned to German control. As coal and steel were the basic ingredients of war, many European states were nervous at this prospect. To overcome this, it was proposed to bring the national coal and steel industries of Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg under common control. This was achieved by the European Coal and Steel Treaty, also referred to as the Treaty of Paris or the CST. Signed in 1951, coming into effect in 1952. Thereafter, in 1957, it was decided to integrate the economies of these states, and the European Economic Community Treaty, also referred to as the Treaty of Rome or the EEC Treaty, was signed, establishing the European Economic Community. From the outset, the United Kingdom chose not to participate in this process as it shared different post-WW2 geopolitical priorities to the countries of continental Europe. The UK was still at the head of its own crumbling empire, the Commonwealth, and thus was less involved in the immediate concerns of post-war Europe. Moreover, as a common law country with its own specific social model, the UK sought instead to reinforce cooperation between it and the United States of America, developing what it sometimes calls the special relationship. This divergence was also underwritten by centuries of animosity between France and the UK and conflicting opinions as to the form future European integration should take. Whilst France and other continental European countries proposed real integration between their national economies an actual partial pooling of their economic and political sovereignty in pan-national European institutions, the UK preferred an intergovernmental model of integration based primarily upon cooperation and no surrender of sovereignty. Thus, when France and Germany, inspired by the success of the Benelux Economic Union, decided to create the EEC in 1957, the United Kingdom chose not to participate and instead proposed the creation of an alternative organisation, the European Free Trade Association, or EFTA. Now, let's take a look at the different models of European integration. The significance of the newly created EEC was twofold. Firstly, it involved a partial transfer of national sovereignty from the individual member states to the newly created community, and secondly, it provided for separate institutions in which the partially transferred national sovereignty could be vested. Amended on a number of occasions, the EEC Treaty has now been succeeded by the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU. The scope of the original EEC Treaty was very wide, establishing common European policies in areas such as agriculture, fisheries, transport, etc. Moreover, the EEC Treaty established an internal market providing for freedom of movement in areas of goods, workers, services and capital. Finally, the treaty established a competition policy based largely on the provisions of the US Sherman Act 1890, prohibiting, amongst other things, monopolization and the abuse of dominance by undertakings in a dominant position. The EEC created a complex institutional structure governed by the European Commission, which partly plays the role of an executive branch, a council and an assembly responsible for the adoption of legislation, and a court to apply its laws. However, as we have seen, the EEC was not the only attempt at interstate cooperation that was occurring in Europe at this time. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe, coming within the influence of the former USSR, had already created the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMECON, to promote economic cooperation between them. And shortly after the creation of the EEC, EFTA was created at the initiative of the United Kingdom, pursuant to the Stockholm Convention of 1960. Made up of the non-EEC fringe or periphery Western European economies, EFTA created a free trade area between its member states, more limited in scope than the EEC single market. Applying only to trade in industrial goods, it involved a minimal surrender of national sovereignty, and each of the member states retained a right of veto as regards the adoption of EFTA rules. Moreover, institutionally, EFTA was also far less ambitious than the EEC, being governed by only one institution, the EFTA Council. To a certain extent, it can be said that EFTA turned out to be less successful than its EEC counterpart, and only 2 years after its creation, the UK was already seeking membership of the EEC. Eventually, and only after a protracted struggle, the EEC decided to allow the UK, Denmark and Ireland to join the community in 1973. Thereafter, Greece, Portugal and Spain joined, and in the 1990s many of the remaining EFTA member states followed suit. At the turn of the century, many of the former COMECON countries, no longer under Soviet influence, also joined the organisation. Thus, the EEC was clearly the most successful of the European integration models established after World War II. Now, let's look more closely at the creation of the European Union. In 1992, following the adoption of the Treaty on European Union, the TEU, the European Union was created. The activity of the former EEC was incorporated into the newly created European Union, and the scope of the new organisation was extended beyond economic matters to cooperation in 2 new areas of activity: foreign affairs and secure policy and justice and home affairs. The TEU also changed the name of the EEC to the European Community. Thereafter, a number of further treaties were adopted by the member states before a new consolidating constitutional treaty was proposed in 2004. However, during the adoption process of this treaty, the citizens of France, the Netherlands and Ireland rejected it. In its place, the Lisbon Treaty was adopted, allowing for the establishment of an institutional framework sufficiently flexible to facilitate a European Union made up of 28 member states. Significant amendments introduced by the Lisbon Treaty include the conferring of a legal personality on the European Union, alteration of the process providing for the amendment of treaties in the future, introduction of the possibility of member states leaving the European Union, expansion of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and finally the suppression of the EC, which is now an integral part of the EU, and a rebranding of the EC Treaty as a Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU. Finally, let's look briefly at the area of monetary union and the adoption of the euro. Shortly after the creation of the European Union in 1992, and pursuant to the provisions of the TEU, some member states established monetary union, creating a common currency between them, named the euro. Although initially successful, the currency fell victim to the diverging economic conditions in place in each of its member states. Not applicable to all member states, the euro probably represents the point of no return as regards the establishment of a two-speed Europe, a situation not unlike that in the late 1950s when the EEC and EFTA proposed two competing models of European integration. Once again, although perhaps without the enthusiasm of the past, the German-French axis is at the heart of promoting increased European integration. Presumably, as in the past, the remaining non-participating member states, for the most part former EFTA and Comecon states, will eventually participate should the increased integration prove successful. We hope you enjoyed this introduction to the origin of the European Union.